Welcome to an IFLScience audio interview with me, your host, Eleanor Higgs. Did you know that your mouth holds the second largest microbiome in your body after your gut, and that the impact of the bacteria that live there can have far-reaching implications for the rest of your health? Today we're speaking to an expert, Martijn Verhulst, Medical Liaison Manager, Medical Affairs at Sunstar, to find out all about the oral microbiome. Well, Martijn, thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to talk all things the oral microbiome. But to start with, could you please introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about what you do?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Eleanor, for having me on your show. It's a real pleasure, and I think the topic of today is super interesting as well. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. About me personally, my name is Martijn. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I have a background in biomedical sciences. I also hold a PhD from the Academic Center for Dentistry in Amsterdam, where I did research into the relationship between oral health and general health, focusing on diabetes. Nowadays, I work for Sunstar, and Sunstar is a multinational company active in the healthcare domain, including oral care. And like myself, Sunstar is very much interested in the relationship between oral health and general health, as it's one of the core pillars of our mission to help people everywhere achieve better health and enhance their quality of life. So, about my personal responsibilities within the company, that includes working very closely with universities, professional organizations, and together we work on educational activities, programs, but also we foster research and innovation in the dental field so that we, among other things, understand better this relationship between oral health and general health. So that would be very shortly my personal introduction.
Wonderful, yes. Really interesting to see how it's all related. So before we get into that, let's start with the most obvious. What is the oral microbiome?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. And that's a very good first question, I think, to set the stage to understand what the oral microbiome is. In terms of pure definition, the oral microbiome refers to all the microorganisms, their genetic information, and the environment in which they interact. So that's the mouth. Maybe that doesn't really tell everything. So about the microbiome more in detail, these microorganisms, they cover practically all the surfaces in your mouth. So that's your teeth, it's your tongue, it's the inside of your cheeks, your palate, your throat. And so far, research has been able to identify approximately or even more than 700 bacterial species in the oral microbiome. So more than 700. And we also know that, for example, the oral cavity is even the second largest microbial habitat in the human body, second only after the gut. So it's really, really huge. Now, in the earlier days, these microorganisms, they were seen as individuals, right? They were separated from their environment, basically living on their own. However, since then, a lot of advancements in technology and research has been made, and we are now able to identify bacterial species. We have mapped out their entire genome, for example, and we're just starting to unravel how incredibly complex and smart the interaction is between these microorganisms and the rest of the body, and especially the interaction with the host immune system. So nowadays there's really a shift ongoing, a paradigm shift, where more and more we're starting to see the microorganisms first as communities living in your oral cavity rather than individuals, but also as almost an integral part of their environment where they live, and therefore also of the rest of the body, right? Because we know the mouth and the rest of the body aren't just separated, they're part of one body. So that completely changes the narrative of the microbiome and the role it plays in health and disease. And I think this paradigm shift will be very important also for the rest of our conversation today. So that really sets the stage, I think, for the rest.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's so interesting that you can see them both as individuals and also as within your own body, living in the environment, and should be seen as a whole. How does the composition of the oral microbiome vary from person to person? Is it the same across everyone? Are there some common aspects? What's going on there?
Yeah, no, absolutely not, and absolutely yes. So again, that's a very interesting question, and the short answer is that yes, although there are similarities between people, right? Most people have certain bacteria in their mouth, like Fusobacterium nucleatum, which is a very common one. However, every single person also has a unique microbiome. And that's, of course, fascinating. The variation between people is even so distinct and so large that researchers believe that the microbiome can even be used as a unique microbial fingerprint, like the ones on your hands. So that is how distinct the microbiome is between people. So there's no second microbiome like the ones that you have yourself. And I think to understand why that is, we really need to go back to how our personal microbiome develops through life. To start with, the genetic makeup of an individual is very important in establishing a personal microbiome, but the environment is equally important, because actually even before you're being born, you are already indirectly exposed to the oral microbiome of your mother, because her own microbiome, her own oral microbiome, talks to her immune system, and the immune system of the mother in turn is communicating with the fetus. So in a way, even before birth, the immune system of the fetus is already trained and prepared for future exposure to microorganisms. And this is, by the way, also why it's so important for pregnant women to take good care of their oral health, right? So that the microbiome is in a healthy, balanced state, and therefore also communicates in a healthy way to the fetus. Going back to the baby that is now about to be born, because that's actually the very first time the oral cavity will be exposed excessively to microorganisms. And therefore, that's really the starting point of so-called colonization of the oral cavity with microorganisms. And interestingly, research has also shown that when you compare babies who were born the natural way versus those born by a cesarean, there are already distinct differences in the early colonizers because of the difference in exposure. And there's for example, a good example is that those born naturally, they have much higher numbers of lactobacilli species, because those bacteria are also dominantly present in the vaginal microbiome, whereas babies born by cesarean have much higher numbers of Patrimonas species. And research also shows that the mode of delivery, so natural versus cesarean, also influences the diversity of the baby's microbiome. With those babies who are born naturally, they show a higher diversity. And these differences don't just occur very, very quickly after birth, but they can be observed up until the age of 4 or 5, and maybe even longer. So it really has a prolonged effect. When you then go back to the now born child, during the first month of life, the mouth is steadily colonized with microorganisms. And this colonization, as I mentioned, is heavily influenced by the genetic profile of the baby, but also by his environment, right? You can think of nutrition, you can think of contact with a mother, but also contact with other humans and the environment as a whole. So, for example, when the milk teeth start to erupt, the environment in the mouth drastically changes again, because now the mouth has new surfaces, right? You have these new teeth who provide new surfaces for microorganisms to colonize. And the same happens again when they start changing their milk teeth for the permanent ones. Again, the environment changes. Maybe when they reach their teenagers, they get orthodontic treatment. When they are growing up, children, they establish certain nutritional habits. They start brushing their teeth themselves. So these are all changes to the environment that happens when a child's growing up. When you are growing older, a healthy microbiome at least does more or less stabilize across over time, but it does become less diverse when you are reaching an older age. So the microbiome diversity goes down when you reach older age. So just to summarize that up, as you can imagine, there are so many factors that influence the composition of the microbiome. There's the genetics, there's the environment, there's lifestyle, age. And with all these influences, you can imagine that everyone has his or her unique microbiome. So there's not a single one that is the same as another one.
That's incredible. Could you tell at sort of 3 or 4 months old by looking at a microbiome whether the baby was born vaginally or via C-section? Would that be possible?
Well, not per se 100%, but indeed, as I mentioned, there are some bacterial species that are more prevalent in babies that are born naturally. So I mentioned this lactobacilli species that you see more often in babies who are delivered the normal way, I would say. And other bacterial species like Petrimonas, they are more dominant in babies who are born the cesarean way. Yeah.
That's amazing. And also what you said about diet as well is what I was going to ask you, because we often hear that eating things like miso soup or kimchi is very good for your gut health. Are there factors or foods that influence your oral microbiome in that way?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, nutrition has an impact, and it has a huge impact on the composition and the balance of the microbiome. And I find it interesting that you mentioned kimchi as an example, because some consider kimchi as a source of probiotics that develop during the fermentation process, right? Kimchi is it's cabbage that you let fermentate over time, and during this fermentation process, bacteria develop, and some of them are considered to be probiotics. And I think that's an interesting one, because when you look at probiotics, what they are defined as living microorganisms that, when administered in adequate amounts, they have an overall health benefit for the user. You mentioned kimchi. Another famous one is yogurt, right?
Yeah.
Yogurt also contains good bacteria. And the theory is that these good bacteria have anti-inflammatory properties, but they also make it difficult for bad bacteria to grow out, because they compete for the same spot in the microbiome. Besides probiotics, there's also prebiotics, and prebiotics are defined, and I'm already apologizing for the technical terms, but prebiotics are defined as a substrate that is selectively utilized by host microorganisms, conferring a health benefit. It may sound extremely complex, but in other words, it just means that they act as a fertilizer for good bacteria. And you can think of whole grains, you can think of onions and garlic, soybeans, certain fruits like apples and bananas. They're also considered as prebiotic, or at least they contain prebiotic components. Again, most of these well-known pro and prebiotics, they are mainly important for the gut microbiome, because that has received most attention in the media, but also in research. It's the most well-researched area of the microbiome. However, there are also a few probiotic bacterial strains known that have an effect on oral health, such as Lactobacillus reuteri. That's also a bacterial strain. By the way, this is also incorporated into one of our own products. Prebiotics for the oral microbiome are quite rare, I would say. There are a few examples like nitrate, xylitol, arginine, citrulline. Now, these prebiotics are also believed to have potential positive effects on the microbiome, but research in those areas is still quite in the early stages. So there's a lot more to discover for those.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's so interesting how it can all, play, each play a different role in how your oral microbiome can be affected. Does it have also then negative consequences for the health to have this mouthful of bacteria? What can be the knock-on impacts further down?
Yeah, that's a funny question. That would be your first idea, right? When we talk about bacteria, we always think it's a dirty thing, and I don't want the bacteria, I want it sterile. What are they doing on my body? But the contrary is actually true. You need a mouthful of bacteria. However, the crucial part is to keep these bacteria in a healthy balance. And this balance is what we call symbiosis. And what we mean by symbiosis is that there's a mutually beneficial relationship among microorganisms themselves, but also between the microorganisms and the host. And this symbiosis is associated with maintaining good oral health and general health, because in a symbiotic state, the microorganisms in your mouth, they fine-tune your immune system. They keep your mucosa, so that's the cells that cover the inside of your mouth, for example. They keep it in a healthy state. They are involved in the digestion of food. They help with processing environmental chemicals, and they have many other important functions. So they are crucial for maintaining health. However, unfortunately, this symbiosis is also a very fine balance, and it can very easily tip over. For example, a healthy symbiotic microbiome contains good bacteria, but it may also contain a number of bad bacteria that are associated with disease, maybe a few. However, in a symbiotic state, these bad bacteria, they are kept in check by the good bacteria and by your own immune system. However, these bad bacteria can start taking over when the circumstances are right for them. For example, they need nutrition to grow, like everything, and they mainly feed on sugar. Certain bacteria do, at least. So you can imagine that when you consume too much sugar, these bad bacteria, and just to name an example, Streptococcus mutans, for example, they can start taking over and tip this balance unfavorably. So in scientific terms, you shift from a symbiosis to a so-called dysbiosis. And this Streptococcus mutans, for example, is associated in literature with the development of cavities, which is why you always hear about how too much sugar causes cavities, right? But that's not because of the sugar itself. That's because of the bacteria that feed on it. So in a dysbiotic state, you have too many of these bacteria. These bad bacteria start taking over. They start digesting the sugar that you eat. And as a byproduct, they start to produce acids. And it's these acids that cause cavities because they eat away at your enamel. And that's the hard white stuff, right? That covers the outside of your teeth. So that's just an example of how a dysbiosis can lead to bad oral health. There's also bacteria that are associated with gum disease, periodontitis, periodontal disease. And again, in symbiosis, these bacteria, they are held in check. But because of certain risk factors, such as smoking, genetics, systemic diseases, you name it, these bad bacteria can start taking over again and cause a dysbiosis. And your immune system responds to that dysbiosis by causing inflammation in the gums, right? They try to kill these bacteria because they don't belong there and they're causing issues. So your immune system starts killing these bacteria, which is in the end what you want. But as a collateral damage, this inflammation also destroys connective tissue in your gums. And eventually this can spread to the bone that supports your teeth, right? That keeps your teeth in place. And then we talk about periodontitis, which is the severe form of gum disease. And this whole intricate process of inflammation creates an environment which these bad bacteria, and we mainly call these bacteria gram-negative bacteria, they absolutely love this environment. There are enough nutrients, it's relatively low on oxygen, and they start to thrive even more, causing more inflammation. And more inflammation causes more tissue destruction causes more inflammation, and so on. So if you don't take care of your microbiome, you can easily end up in this vicious cycle that causes diseases such as caries and gum disease.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that. We think always as kids we got told, oh, you can't have too many sweets, you can't have too many fizzy drinks, it's all, it's bad for your teeth. And it's not necessarily bad for your teeth because of the sugar content of the drinks, although that doesn't help, but also that it's feeding, these bad bacteria that are taking over. If you wanted to do something for your oral microbiome, maybe reset the system, something like mouthwash, how would you take care of your oral microbiome in this way? Would mouthwash be beneficial, or would it wipe out good and bad bacteria in your mouth?
That's a very good question. And before you're answering your specific question about mouthwash, I think you also asked the crucial question: what is the best way to look after your microbiome, right? And by far, the most important thing you can do to look after your oral microbiome is good oral hygiene, by which I mean toothbrushing and cleaning in between your teeth. For example, with floss, a pick, or an interdental brush. By brushing your teeth and cleaning in between your teeth, and we call this mechanical plaque control, you disrupt and remove the plaque that is building up over time. Now, I don't think I mentioned plaque before, but plaque is this sticky film. It's a biofilm that starts covering your teeth when you haven't brushed for a while. Everybody develops plaque. And the thing about this plaque is it's full of bacteria. And some of them are good ones, but they also contain the bad ones that cause disease. However, if you disrupt the plaque regularly by brushing, for example, this plaque remains what we call immature, and it's therefore less pathogenic. And by that, we mean that it's less able to cause, for example, caries or gum disease. Now, we talked about symbiosis before, right? So good oral hygiene is the single most important thing you can do to maintain symbiosis. However, we also mentioned other factors that can influence the microbiome. Some of them you cannot influence. It's like genetics. That's what you are born with, so you cannot change that. But some of them you can influence. You can think about these lifestyle choices that we mentioned before, eating less refined sugars, drink enough water to avoid a dry mouth, because saliva that is in your mouth also helps fighting these bacteria and prevent the acids from your produced by your bacteria to damage your enamel. You can limit the consumption of alcohol. All these things can really help you to take care of your oral microbiome. Now, the second element that you asked was whether using a mouthwash is a good thing or not, or whether it's detrimental or not. And I think it's very, very important in this story to make a distinction between antiseptic and non-antiseptic mouthwashes. Right? So we have antiseptic mouthwashes, and they are meant to kill bacteria. And they usually do this without discriminating the good ones from the bad. And I know this may sound a bit scary, but in some cases, it's the only thing that helps, and then it's absolutely needed. Think, for example, of a drastic surgery that you had, and you need a sterile environment to start the healing process. Or if mechanical plaque removal by brushing or cleaning in between teeth is not enough to take away severe inflammation for whatever reason. And in those cases, the benefits of having this mouthwash and killing these bacteria, they outweigh the unwanted effects of temporarily destroying your microbiome. However, these antiseptic mouthwashes, they are usually recommended by a professional for a limited duration, and they are not really recommended when there's no need and your mouth is healthy. There are then, on the other hand, also non-antiseptic mouthwashes, and these can, for example, contain flavors to give you an extra fresh feeling, when you finish brushing. But I think the most important function these mouthwashes usually have is to provide an additional source of fluoride next to your toothpaste. Because fluoride, it's a mineral that is very important for preventing dental caries. It's, besides limiting sugar intake, it's the most important preventative measure you can take to avoid caries. And sometimes you need this extra source of fluoride in some cases, if you're, for example, more susceptible to develop caries. So I would say that's the main benefit of using these mouthwashes. So this distinction between antiseptic and non-antiseptic is really important for this story.
Yeah, absolutely. You can, wipe out everything in your mouth, or you can, sort of just have a nice fresh feeling after you finish brushing as well. Are there emerging technologies in this field or research findings that offer new insights, or what's the latest in this, oral microbiome world?
Yeah, to highlight the latest one, it's a challenge because this field is developing and innovating so quickly, and what was published a few years ago may already be a little bit outdated. I think in terms of research, one of the most recent developments and most interesting developments is the use of sequencing. It's called sequencing instead of culturing. Now, with bacterial culturing, what we mean by that is you take, for example, a sample from a subject and you let bacteria then grow in laboratory conditions. So then you get information about a few specific individual bacteria, right? But not about the entire microbiome, because some bacteria cannot be cultured. And that's not what you want, because as we said, it's about the entire microbiome, right? It all communicates with each other. So you want a more detailed information. Now with sequencing, you can get that information because you can also get information about non-culturable bacteria. So that means that the information you get about the microbiome is way more detailed and complete. One of the other interesting developments, I think, is applied research into pro and prebiotics. So far, as I said, the large majority of studies focused on bacteria that originate from the gut. But as you now know, bacteria also have their specific niche, right? Bacteria in the gut, they belong in the gut, and those in the mouth, they belong in the mouth. So for pro and prebiotics, you would rather want to research and you rather want bacteria that originate from the mouth. And there are some exciting developments ongoing in that field right now. So that's, those are interesting trends, I would say.
What is the most interesting or the most fascinating part of the oral microbiome to you?
That's a good question. For me personally, considering my background, I am really intrigued by the holistic view of the microbiome that is now emerging. So over the decades, as I said, we really shifted from viewing bacteria as individual microorganisms that were linked to disease. We shifted to first microbial communities, and now we are even talking about an ecosystem that is closely connected to the rest of the body, both in health and in disease. And that's a true paradigm shift. And I think this paradigm shift has massive implications for how we see health and disease, and also how we treat and prevent oral diseases in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because you see, sometimes you have patients and they have a problem, they say, oh, I've got shoulder pain. And then it turns out they have a problem with their diaphragm, and it's because the body is so interlinked and the pain is referred and that sort of thing. So looking at it as a whole makes a lot more sense to me rather than tiny individual parts of it.
Absolutely. And that's also the core of our belief at Sunstar. It's really about this holistic view. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to mention? Is there anything else you would want people to know about the oral microbiome?
Well, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the effect that the microbiome can have for general health. Right? We talked about the effect on oral health, but you also have effect on general health. For example, there are oral microorganisms that are associated with cardiovascular disease or with diabetes. A few years ago, the New York Times published an article on research that showed that certain bacteria that belong to the mouth were found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. There are bacteria that are involved in regulating blood pressure by a complex process of converting nitrate into nitrite. So it's not just about the oral health, but a healthy microbiome also has a direct effect on general health. And I think that's something worth mentioning. And it ties back to what we just said of this holistic view that the microbiome can also have a knock-on effect on the rest of the body. So yeah, I would just like to wrap up with saying that we should consider the oral microbiome not just as a collection of bacteria, but as an integral part of the rest of the body. And maintaining a healthy microbiome is crucial for not only maintaining oral health, but also systemic health. So whatever your age. And the best way to do that is by proper oral hygiene and taking care of your lifestyle. And I think that's a lifelong commitment. So I think that's quite a lengthy wrap up, but that's, I think, the key takeaway messages of this conversation.
Brilliant. I think that's the perfect place to end it. Thank you so much for joining me.
Super. No, thank you for having me. And it's been a pleasure talking to you.